The city of Oakhaven breathes through fear and invoices, and I am the one who signs both. My name is Victor Volkov, and in the underworld, I am a ghost, a war strategist, and an untouchable king. When rival crews hear my boots on the pavement, they lower their voices to a terrified whisper. When politicians hear my phone ring, they immediately raise their prices because they know the cost of doing business with a monster. I built this empire on a single, ironclad rule: no one gets close. I keep my armor tight and my heart locked away in a vault. Trust is a luxury that people in my position simply cannot afford, and love is a weakness I refuse to carry because it gives your enemies a place to aim. I was in the middle of a high-stakes armed negotiation in a shipyard, surrounded by men with submachine guns and crates of illicit cargo. The tension was thick enough to choke on, and one wrong word would have turned the pier into a graveyard. Suddenly, the screech of tires echoed through the salty air. A small, dented delivery van jerked to a halt right behind my armored SUV. A woman climbed out, her face red with fury, and marched directly toward me. I stared at her in disbelief as she stomped through my security perimeter. She wasn't wearing tactical gear or expensive jewelry. She was a bookstore owner with flour dusting her sleeves and a smudge of ink on her cheek. She didn't tremble, and her voice didn't shake as she looked me dead in the eye and scolded me for blocking her delivery truck. My men, hardened killers who had seen the worst of humanity, reached for their holsters, their fingers itching to pull the trigger on this intruder. I raised a single finger, signaling them to stand down. I felt a strange, foreign spark in my chest. Curiosity. No one had spoken to me like a regular human being in over a decade. Everyone either groveled, lied, or died. But this woman just saw a man in a fancy suit being a nuisance. She told me she had a shipment of rare first editions and fresh sourdough that was going to sit in the sun because my overpriced tank was in the way. I pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills, enough to buy her entire shop and the building it sat in, and offered it as hush money for the inconvenience. I expected her to take it. She didn't even look at the money. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pad of paper. With a flick of her wrist, she scribbled something down and slapped it against my chest. It was a parking ticket she had written herself. My soldiers stood frozen, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence, waiting for me to order her disappearance. They expected me to punish her for her insolence, for her lack of respect for the crown I wore. Instead, I did something that shocked them even more. I laughed. The sound was rusty and deep, feeling strange in my throat after years of silence and grim expressions. It was a genuine, belly-deep laugh that cut through the tension of the weapons exchange. She rolled her eyes, told me the fine was one sincere apology, and marched back to her van. She didn't look back to see if I moved. She just expected me to do the right thing, because she was a citizen and I was a person. I signaled my driver to shift the SUV immediately. As she drove past, I caught a glimpse of her name on the side of the van: Elena Maris. Against my better judgment, I kept the ticket. The moment I returned to my penthouse, the curiosity turned into a professional necessity. I couldn't have an anomaly like that walking around my city without knowing exactly who she was. I called Sergey, my head of intelligence, and ordered a full-file pull on her. I wanted everything: her blood type, her childhood bank records, and the name of her first pet. By dawn, a thick folder sat on my mahogany desk. Name: Elena Maris. Age: 28. She had a perfectly clean record, not even a real speeding ticket to her name. She owned a small bookstore cafe called the Inkwell that was barely breaking even. The file said she volunteered 3 times a week at a local youth shelter, teaching kids how to read and write. There were no hidden debts, no criminal boyfriends, and no leverage points I could find. She had no history of fear, no trauma that made her lash out. She was just fundamentally brave. That made her incredibly dangerous to a man like me. As I flipped to the final page, a grainy surveillance photo caught my eye. It wasn't one of mine. Someone else was also watching her from a black sedan parked across the street. My blood ran cold. In my world, when 2 predators watch the same prey, it usually ends in a bloodbath. I recognized the plates on the black sedan. It belonged to the Sokolov Syndicate, a rival group that had been trying to chip away at my eastern territories for months. They had tagged Elena as my interest, simply because I had laughed at her and moved my car. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a pressure move, a way to get to me. They were already planning a move to either kidnap her for ransom or coerce her into spying on me. They thought they had found a crack in my armor, a soft spot they could poke with a knife. I listened to the intercepted chatter on the encrypted line Sergei provided. They were talking about her like she was a piece of meat, debating which alleyway would be best to grab her in. They had no idea that by even looking at her, they had signed their own death warrants. I couldn't let them touch her. But I also knew she would never accept help from a man she considered a bully. I decided to play it safe. I assigned a shadow guard to follow her. For 3 days, my best operative, a man who could blend into a brick wall, followed her every move. But Elena was sharper than the intelligence files suggested. She began to notice the same silent man in the gray hoodie standing at the bus stop, sitting in the cafe, and walking a dog that never seemed to bark. Instead of being scared and hiding in her apartment, she did exactly what I should have expected. She confronted him. When he refused to answer, she followed him back to his car, noted the plates, and marched straight into my high-rise office building. She pushed past 2 receptionists and 3 armed security guards, threatening to call the fire department if they didn't let her through. She burst into my office without an appointment or permission, her eyes blazing with a fire that made the city lights outside look dim. She slammed her purse onto my desk and demanded to know why I was stalking her. I leaned back in my chair, trying to look composed, and told her it was for her own protection. She didn't buy it for a second. She leaned over the desk and told me that protection without consent is just control. The argument that followed was unlike any battle I had ever fought. We clashed over philosophy like 2 generals on a battlefield, but the weapons were words, sparks, and steel-edged logic. She told me that I was a coward who hid behind walls and men with guns because I was too afraid to live in the real world. She said that fear was a cheap leadership tool used by small men who wanted to feel big. I countered by telling her that the world was a meat grinder, and that her basic decency wouldn't stop a bullet. I told her that safety was an expensive commodity that I provided for people who didn't even know they were in danger. Neither of us backed down an inch. We stood toe-to-toe in the center of the office, the silence between our sentences humming with an energy that felt like an electric storm. She told me she would rather take her chances with the monsters she didn't know than be a pet for the one she did. Both of us walked away from that office thinking about the other more than we cared to admit. To prove her point and my frustration, I gave the order to cancel the shadow guard publicly. It was a calculated risk, but I knew the Sokolovs were greedy. Without the shadow guard, Elena was targeted that very same night as she was closing up her bookstore. I didn't send a team this time. I went myself. I sat in the darkness of a nearby alley, watching as a van slid up to the curb and 3 men hopped out with zip ties and rags. They thought she was an easy mark, a defenseless baker who would scream and crumble. They were wrong. She fought like a wildcat, swinging her heavy bag of flour and kicking at their shins. But there were too many of them. I stepped out of the shadows, moving with a surgical violence that I had perfected over decades. I didn't use a gun. It was too loud. I used my hands and the environment. In 60 seconds, 2 of them were unconscious on the pavement with broken limbs, and the third was pinned against the brick wall by his throat. I made sure Elena saw everything. I wanted her to understand the reality of the world she lived in. I wanted her to see the monster I truly was so she would finally stay away. She stood there breathless. I expected her to thank me, or perhaps to tremble and finally ask for my help. Instead, she was absolutely furious. She didn't look at the men groaning on the ground. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and rage. She told me that I was the reason they were there in the first place. She said I brought danger with me like a dark storm cloud, and that my very presence poisoned everything it touched. She accused me of playing God with her life just to prove a point about how unsafe she was. The accusation stung more than any physical wound I had ever received. I felt the words, "I'm sorry," bubbling up in my chest, a phrase I hadn't used since I was a child in the orphan cells. I almost apologized. Almost. But my pride and the habits of a lifetime held the words back. I couldn't be weak, not even in front of her. I took a deep breath, adjusted my cuffs, and looked at her bruised wrist. Instead of an apology, I offered her a deal that I knew she couldn't refuse if she cared about the kids she taught. I offered her a future for them. I told her I would fund her youth shelter fully, not just a donation, but a complete overhaul. I would pay for a full renovation, state-of-the-art security, a permanent food program, and educational grants for every child there. I promised there would be no strings attached and no mention of my name in the press. She didn't believe me at first, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. She told me she knew men like me didn't do anything for free. She demanded a legal contract, full transparency, and an independent oversight committee to make sure the money wasn't dirty. I agreed to every single one of her terms without a moment of hesitation. I had my lawyers draft the papers by the next morning. It was the most lopsided deal in the history of the Volkov empire, but I didn't care. I just wanted to see that fire in her eyes turn into something else. When my advisors saw the numbers and the lack of kickbacks, they began to panic. They whispered in the hallways that I was losing my mind, or worse, my edge. They feared I was becoming a man with a heart, and they knew hearts were easy to break. The internal revolt started almost immediately. My captains, men who had bled for the throne, gathered in the boardroom with grim faces. They warned me that compassion looked like weakness to our enemies. They said that spending millions on a shelter while the Sokolovs were still breathing was a recipe for a coup. One captain, a man named Ivan, who had always been too ambitious for his own good, suggested that I was being led around by a skirt. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood up, walked to the head of the table, and replaced him and his closest ally on the spot. I did it calmly and permanently, making sure the rest of the room understood that my compassion for the shelter didn't mean I had lost my stomach for the necessary evils of our trade. The room went silent as the guards escorted them out. I told the remaining captains that we were evolving, and anyone who couldn't adapt would find themselves in the same position as Ivan. While I was cleaning house, Elena was at the shelter, learning for the first time exactly what I had done to make her dream a reality. A week later, Elena stood in the middle of the renovated shelter, looking at the brand-new beds, the high-tech security cameras, and the industrial kitchen that was already prepping fresh meals. There was a new library corner filled with every book she had ever mentioned in her shop. She looked for my name on a plaque or a donated buy sign, but she found nothing. I never showed up for credit or a photo op. I watched from a tinted window in a car across the street as she hugged one of the kids. Her certainty about me, the idea that I was just a one-dimensional villain, began to wobble. She saw the good the money was doing, and she knew it was my money. She knew that I had risked my reputation among my own men to give these kids a chance she never had. She spent the afternoon wandering through the halls, touching the new walls, as if trying to find the catch. When she couldn't find one, she did something she had sworn she would never do. She visited me voluntarily. She came to my home, bypassing the gate guards, and asked to speak to the man behind the shadow. She didn't storm in this time. She waited for the receptionist to announce her. I led her to a small, quiet room in the back of the penthouse, away from the screens and the maps of the city's smuggling routes. We shared tea instead of threats. The steam rose between us, softening the sharp edges of the room. In the quiet, I found myself talking. I admitted things I had never told anyone. I told her how I grew up in war zones and orphan cells, where the only way to survive was to be the person everyone else feared. I told her that I didn't choose this life. I built it, because the alternative was a shallow grave. She softened, her hand hovering near mine on the table. She admitted that she hated powerful men because they reminded her of the people who had let her down her entire life. She saw the boy I used to be, the one who just wanted to be safe. We both stayed in that room long after the tea grew cold, that neither of us wanting to go back to our respective worlds. But the peace was shattered when a red dot appeared on the wall. A sniper had targeted the window. I didn't think. I acted on pure instinct. I threw myself across the table, pulling her down to the floor before the shot even landed. The The bullet hit the window, but the reinforced bulletproof glass didn't shatter. It fractured like frozen lightning, holding firm against the impact. I held her against my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was shaking after the adrenaline spiked, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't from the thrill of the fight. I was shaking from the pure, paralyzing thought of losing her. If I had been a second slower, if the glass had been a lower grade, she would have been gone. The Sokolovs weren't just sending a message anymore. They were trying to rip the heart out of my chest. I called Sergei and told him to burn every Sokolov asset to the ground. Then I looked at Elena, who was pale and trembling in my arms. I told her she couldn't go back to her apartment. I moved her into my most secure safe house immediately, surrounded by 30 of my most loyal guards. I couldn't take another chance with her life. The safe house was a fortress hidden in the hills, filled with everything she could possibly need. But to her, it felt like a gilded cage. We were stuck in forced proximity, two people from different planets living under the same roof. We spent the nights playing long, silent chess games, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the occasional move of a wooden piece. We had late talks over glasses of wine, where the barriers continued to crumble. She saw my discipline, my ironclad restraint, and my strange, unexpected gentleness with the children from the shelter whom I had relocated there for their own safety. I spent an hour one afternoon helping a young boy fix a broken toy, and I felt her watching me from the doorway. She saw that the monster had a soul, and I saw that the baker had a spine made of diamonds. One evening, she caught me in the library reading her favorite author, a poet she had mentioned once during our argument. She didn't say anything. She just sat down beside me and started to read over my shoulder. It was the first time I felt like a man instead of a king. The piece was a lie, and we both knew it. My enemies broadcasted a message on every encrypted channel I owned. "We found your weak spot," the voice hissed, and then Elena's photo appeared on the screen. It wasn't a hidden photo. It was a clear shot of her laughing at the shelter. They were telling the entire underworld that the great Victor Volkov had a heart, and that it was beatable. My vision went red, a cold, calculated rage taking over my mind. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to erase them from history. I declared open war on the Sokolov Syndicate. I told my men that there would be no prisoners and no mercy. The citywide crackdown began within the hour, my soldiers flooding the streets like a black tide. Every warehouse, every front business, and every safe house the Sokolovs owned was targeted simultaneously. I was a force of nature, destroying everything in my path to ensure that no one would ever dare look at her again. But in my fury, I made a mistake. I left a gap in the perimeter during a shift change. That small error was all they needed to strike. Elena was taken during a necessary supply run, despite the heavy guard and the armored vehicles I had provided. They used a decoy, a distraction that drew my men away for just 30 seconds, and that was all they needed. They snatched her right off the sidewalk. When Sergei told me, I nearly leveled the building with my bare hands. I received a video feed 10 minutes later. She was inside enemy territory, tied to a chair in a damp warehouse, surrounded by men who wanted to see me crawl. But Elena Maris didn't give them the satisfaction. Even with a knife to her throat, she refused to beg or cry. She looked directly into the camera lens as if she could see me on the other side. She didn't call for help. Instead, she looked her captor in the eye and insulted him on camera. She told him he was a small, pathetic man who could only feel powerful by hurting women. She laughed in his face, her defiance so bright it seemed to blind them. I felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly choked me. She was holding the line until I got there. I was coming. I didn't go in explosive. I went surgical. I didn't want a chaotic gunfight where a stray bullet could hit her. I moved through the night like a shadow, taking out Sokolov's outer rim with silent precision. I dismantled 3 of their major operations in one single night, cutting off their communications and their power. It was precision terror. I left one man alive at each site to tell the others that I was coming. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in. I wanted them to know that every breath they took was a gift I was about to revoke. There was no wasted motion in my path. By the time I reached the main warehouse where they were holding her, the enemy was already fraying at the edges. terrified of the ghost that was haunting them. I didn't wait for my backup. I walked into the hostage site alone, my silhouette framed by the moonlight in the doorway. I didn't even have my gun drawn. I just had the cold certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. I stood there, watching them tremble as they realized the devil had finally arrived for his due. The Sokolov leader stepped forward, his hand on Elena's shoulder, trying to offer exchange terms. He wanted his territory back. He wanted the war to end. He wanted his life spared. I offered him none of it. I stood in the center of the room and tossed a tablet onto the floor. I revealed that I had already hacked and drained their offshore accounts, rerouted their escape routes into police checkpoints, and purchased the loyalty of their own lieutenants. I told him that he wasn't a boss anymore. He was a dead man standing in a room he didn't own. The air in the warehouse changed as his own men began to realize the truth. They looked at the tablet, then at me, then at their failing leader. In a stunning display of my influence, half of their men switched sides mid-standoff, turning their weapons toward their own boss. The betrayal was silent and absolute. The Sokolov leader realized he was alone, surrounded by enemies he had thought were his brothers. I didn't look at him, I only looked at Elena. I watched her face as she realized I had won before I ever stepped inside. The rescue was a blur of close combat and tight corridors. I moved through the remaining loyalists like a scythe through wheat, my focus entirely on the woman in the chair. I reached her and shoved the leader aside with a force that sent him sprawling. I knelt in front of her, my hands shaking as I worked to untie the zip ties. I had never been so scared in my life, not even when I was staring down a firing squad. Her wrists were bruised and her face was smudged with dirt, but she was alive. She touched my face with a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the scar on my cheek, and whispered, "You came." I looked at her, the mask of the ruthless boss finally shattering completely. I answered without thinking, the truth pouring out of me like blood from a wound. "Always," I said. The word was a promise, a vow, and a confession all wrapped into one. I lifted her into my arms and carried her out of that den of vipers, leaving the ruins of the Sokolov syndicate behind us. I felt the weight of her in my arms and knew I would never let go. Back in the armored car, the silence between us turned electric. The city lights blurred past the windows, but all I could see was her. I realized that the rules I had lived by for 20 years were gone. I admitted to her that she was my exception, the one person who had managed to walk through my fire without burning. I told her she was my blind spot, the person I would burn the world down for just to keep safe. I told her that choosing her was the most dangerous thing I had ever done, and yet, it was the only choice that made sense. I was raw, vulnerable, and completely exposed. I expected her to be terrified of the weight of that confession, to want to run back to her bookstore and her sourdough and her quiet life. I braced myself for the rejection, for the moment she would realize that being with me meant living in the shadows forever. I told her I would understand if she left, that I would even help her disappear. But she didn't run. She didn't even look away. She just held my gaze with a terrifying clarity. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching mine for any sign of a lie. She told me that loving a man like me was the most dangerous thing she could imagine. She knew the risks. She had seen the snipers and the kidnappers. She knew that her life would never be simple again. I agreed with her, telling her that I couldn't promise her a life without storms. But I told her I would still choose it every single day if she would have me. I told her that I was willing to change, to find a way to be the man she deserved without losing the power I needed to protect her. She leaned in, the scent of flour and old books still clinging to her skin, and kissed me first. It wasn't a soft, hesitant kiss. It was a claim. It was her way of saying that she was stepping into my world with both feet, and she wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. In that moment, the ruthless boss found a peace that no amount of money or territory could ever buy. We were no longer two separate people. We were a storm and its eye. I spent the next 6 months restructuring my entire operation. I moved away from street-level harm and into higher-level corporate and political control, creating a buffer between my world and the people I used to hurt. There was less blood and more strategic influence. My empire evolved because of her, becoming more efficient and less chaotic. I didn't become weak, I became more focused. Elena remained the moral compass I never knew I needed. My men noticed the change. They saw the way I looked at her, and they saw the way she handled herself in the face of danger. They began to respect her as much as they feared me. In the barracks and the back rooms, they started calling her the Calm. They said she was the only thing that could steady the storm that was Victor Volkov. We weren't just a boss and his girl. We were a partnership that the city had never seen before. I started funding more libraries and schools, using my influence to build things up instead of just tearing them down. The men followed because they knew I was still dangerous. The true test came at a high-profile city fundraiser, an event filled with rivals, politicians, and the elite who had always whispered about me in the dark. Everyone expected me to hide her or to show up alone to maintain my aura of mystery. Instead, I appeared beside Elena openly, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of my arm. There was no denial and no disguise. I wanted the world to see that I had a heart and that I was proud of it. We walked through the ballroom, and the crowd parted like the Red Sea. I saw the rival bosses looking for a sign of weakness, for a way to use her against me. But when they saw the way I stood over her, and the way she looked at them without a hint of fear, they realized the truth. Having a weakness didn't make me beatable. It gave me something to fight for that was more important than pride. No one dared to challenge us that night, the message being sent loud and clear. My territory was guarded by love as much as lead. The rumors of my vulnerability died that evening. Years have passed, and armies still fear my name. My enemies still whisper about the ruthless boss, and the city still runs on the invoices I sign. But my life is no longer just a series of battles and wire transfers. On Saturday afternoons, you won't find me in a boardroom or a warehouse. You'll find me in the courtyard of the youth shelter, sitting cross-legged on the grass. I spend my time fixing broken toy cars and teaching kids how to play chess while Elena laughs beside me, reading stories to a group of toddlers. The kids don't see a crime lord, they see a man who cares. I still rule the night when I have to, and I still protect my empire with a hand of iron. But the daylight belongs to the person who showed me that I was human. The ruthless boss had one weakness, and it turned out to be the greatest strength I ever possessed. My weakness is my love, and I will protect it until my very last breath. I am Victor Volkov, and I am finally at peace. The monster found his home in the baker's heart.